Hey everyone! Tonight we're going to learn about medieval psychology, which is the old science of confidently guessing what's wrong with you and then bleeding about it. Before you get too comfortable, please take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you really like what I do here. Please leave a comment and tell me where you're watching from and what time it is there. It's always interesting to see who is joining us from all over the world. Sadness was not an emotion in medieval psychology. It wasn't sadness. It wasn't stress. It wasn't a perfectly normal thing to do to live in a damp hut while everyone you knew slowly died of things that could have been avoided. No, sadness was a problem that changed over time. Black bile was a cold, dry, mysterious substance that medieval scholars thought sloshed around inside you like emotional tar. It wasn't because life was hard that you felt sad. It was because your plumbing inside had broken down. Medieval ideas said that black bile made people sad, hopeless, and brooding. Doctors politely called it too much thinking. By the way, thinking too much was a sign of a medical problem. Medieval psychology looked at introspection and said, "No way, that's how bile builds up." The diagnosis was easy. Are you feeling sad? Then, congratulations, you are full of bile. The treatment was even easier. Take out the bile. How? Bleeding, throwing up, taking laxatives, sweating, and not eating. Sometimes all of them on one exciting afternoon. Medieval medicine responded to emotional. Doctors took this very seriously when they said, "What if we also make you physically miserable and see which one wins?" They kept an eye on how often you sighed. They kept an eye on your sleep. They looked at whether you were thinking too hard about something far away. People thought that someone who was quietly thinking was more dangerous than someone who was yelling. Silence meant that bile and grief were settling. People dealt with grief in the same way. If your spouse died, medieval psychology didn't suggest comfort, community, or time. It said to use a bowl, a blade, and a strong belief that feelings should be drained like bad wine. Creative people were especially doomed. People who like to think, like poets, artists, and scholars, were thought to be the most likely to be sad. Only small amounts of creativity were allowed. Too much imagination led to bile buildup, which made people sad, which led to treatment, which had often led to death. An extremely useful system. And here's the best part. If you lived through the treatment, the doctor said, success. If you didn't, the problem was technically fixed. In any case, medieval psychology was proud of itself. It was strange, but making sadness into a thing made it feel like I could control it. You couldn't understand how you felt, but you could get them out. You couldn't heal your mind, but you could make your body weaker until you stopped complaining. Sadly, sadness is not a liquid. There is no such thing as black bile, and cutting someone open does not make them feel better. But people in the Middle Ages didn't know that, and it was very sure. After medieval psychology figured out that sadness was a liquid problem, it made another big discovery. Thinking is risky behavior, not dangerous in a philosophical sense, but dangerous in the sense that it could make your brain overheat and ruin your life. It was thought that thinking too much, reflecting, and analyzing were all bad for your health. Medieval scholars thought that the brain was fragile, soft, moist, and very sensitive to vibrations. You made too much heat if you thought too much. The heat dried out the brain. A brain that was dry made people crazy, and insanity naturally led to consequences that usually involved chains. So, medieval psychology said to be moderate in all mental activities. You were told to think just enough to do your job, say your prayers, and not ask any more questions. Curiosity was allowed for a short time, then closely watched. Scholars cautioned that excessive studying, nocturnal reading, or excessive concentration could lead to mental breakdown. Imagine being told that learning Latin was good for your health. Dangerous, medieval psychology essentially looked at education and said, "Careful, that's how it starts." Students were advised to take breaks from thinking, long breaks, ideally permanent ones. Overexerting the mind was believed to drain vital spirits, disturb the humors, and invite melancholy. In other words, thinking too hard made your bile angry again. Everything always came back to bile. The truly unfortunate were philosophers. Medieval society admired philosophers in theory, but distrusted them in practice. A philosopher who asked too many questions wasn't seen as insightful. He was seen as someone courting insanity. If you stared into space too often, people assumed your brain was overheating and quietly rearranging itself. And then there were women. Medieval psychology believed women were especially vulnerable to thinking related disorders because their brains were supposedly colder, wetter, and more emotionally reactive. This meant that serious intellectual thought was considered not just. It was not only ideologically wrong to educate women, but it was also medically irresponsible. They were discouraged from doing so for their own health. Even dreams were looked down upon. Vivid dreams meant that the imagination was running wild, which meant that the mind was unbalanced. If you dreamed too creatively, it meant that your mind hadn't shut down properly. Sleep was supposed to be passive, and if it wasn't, something was wrong. According to medieval psychology, the safest mental state was mild awareness combined with obedience. Think a little, feel a little, never too much of either. Modern psychology encourages reflection. Medieval psychology encouraged a nap. And honestly, given the circumstances, that might have been the healthiest advice they accidentally gave. Once medieval psychology decided that thinking too much could cook your brain, it made another important discovery. Anger was not emotional, it was internal combustion. Specifically, it was your liver overheating like a poorly ventilated furnace. According to medieval theory, anger was caused by too much yellow bile, a hot and dry substance made by the liver. If you were calm, your liver was acting normally. If you were angry, your liver was throwing a tantrum. So, emotional regulation wasn't about self-control, it was about managing your body's temperature. This meant that rage had nothing to do with being frustrated, feeling wronged, or the fact that life in medieval times was objectively terrible. No, you were angry because your organs were too warm. The answer was clear. Cool the body, calm the bile, and tell the liver to stop acting up. Treatments included cold baths, cooling diets, and bloodletting because apparently removing blood was medieval medicine's answer to everything. If someone had a temper, doctors might recommend avoiding spicy foods, alcohol, sex, and excitement. In short, avoid everything that made life tolerable. Medieval psychology also believed that chronic anger could physically warp your personality. Angry people were described as sharp, bitter, aggressive, and hard to deal with, which isn't completely wrong. But instead of therapy or conflict resolution, the advice was simple: lower the heat, eat cold foods, sit quietly, and don't argue. Ideally, stop having opinions. Men were thought to be more likely to get angry because their bodies were naturally hotter. This conveniently explained violence while also justifying it. Women were thought to be less angry because they were colder and wetter, unless their moisture levels went wrong, in which case they became hysterical. Medieval psychology was very proud of how neatly it explained everything while understanding nothing. Even righteous anger was discouraged. Excess passion of any kind was dangerous. A man who shouted too much was not standing up for himself. He was medically unbalanced. A woman who expressed anger at all was well. That was a separate problem involving prayer. In medieval courts, anger was sometimes treated as evidence of poor health rather than bad behavior. If you lashed out, the assumption wasn't that you were wrong. It was that your liver needed intervention. Accountability was optional. Cooling was mandatory. Modern psychology sees anger as a response to stimuli. Medieval psychology saw it as a temperature issue. If only all emotional problems could be solved with fewer spices and a nice cold bath. After medieval psychology finished blaming sadness on bile and anger on overheated organs, it turned its attention to love and immediately decided that love was not romantic, poetic, or meaningful. Love was a diagnosable illness, temporary, dangerous, and best handled by someone with a knife and a bowl. This condition was known as love sickness, and medieval scholars treated it with the seriousness usually reserved for plague outbreaks. Falling in love caused paleness, insomnia, loss of appetite, obsessive thinking, sudden poetry writing, and an alarming tendency to stare at nothing while smiling. In other words, medieval psychology accidentally described being in love and then panicked. Doctors believed love disrupted the balance of the humors, overheating the heart and drying the brain. Too much passion sent vital spirits racing through the body like excited children in a monastery. This was unhealthy. Order had been lost. Fluids were misbehaving again. The symptoms were well documented. A lovesick person might sigh excessively, avoid food, speak in metaphors, and lose interest in practical labor. If a peasant stopped plowing fields because he was thinking about someone's eyes, this was not considered devotion. It was considered a medical emergency. Treatment varied, but none of it involved happiness. Cold baths were common because medieval medicine firmly believed that romance could be rinsed away. Bloodletting was also popular because if you were thinking too much about love, clearly you had too much blood. Dietary changes were recommended as well: bland foods, no spices, no wine, no excitement, and absolutely no seeing the person you loved. Exposure therapy was not part of the plan. In more severe cases, doctors advised marriage not as a celebration of love, but as containment. If the object of affection was unavailable, the solution was distraction. Travel, prayer, physical labor, or intense supervision were all prescribed. Feelings were not explored. They were redirected like inconvenient river water. Women diagnosed with love sickness were often treated as emotionally unstable, while men were treated as temporarily foolish. This double standard was not subtle. Medieval psychology rarely was. The most tragic part is that love was only. They only let love happen in small, controlled doses, like a dangerous medicine. Modern psychology sees love as attachment, chemistry, and connection. Medieval psychology saw it as a fever. And like all medieval fevers, the solution was to drain something until the problem stopped moving. At this point, medieval psychology had explained sadness with bile, anger with overheated organs, and love with feverish insanity. Naturally, it then turned to women and said, yes, this is their fault. Scientifically, according to medieval thinkers, women were more emotional not because of social conditions, limited rights, constant childbirth, or the fact that medieval life was relentlessly brutal. No, women were emotional because they were wetter, colder, more moist, psychologically soggy. This theory was taken very seriously. Medieval psychology believed that the ideal human temperament was hot and dry. Dryness. Stability was associated with dryness, while heat was linked to energy. Men were characterized as inherently hotter and drier, which justified their rationality, authority, and ability to speak publicly without oversight. Conversely, women were perceived as colder and wetter. According to medieval science, moisture induced instability, causing emotions to fluctuate, thoughts to fail to coalesce, and reason to remain unformed. This moisture theory elucidated the dynamics of medieval society. Already wanted to believe. Emotional expression, moisture, crying, excess moisture escaping, anger, improper fluid distribution, intelligence, possible but risky. Too much thinking could overheat the already damp brain, which was obviously a problem. As a result, education for women was considered medically questionable. Intellectual activity might imbalance their humors, dry out their moisture, or worse, give them opinions. Medieval psychology framed restriction as protection. We're not limiting you, they said. We're preserving your health. Medical texts warned that women needed supervision, moderation, and control to maintain balance. Strong emotions were considered dangerous not because they were powerful, but because they disrupted the fragile moisture equilibrium. Emotional regulation was not encouraged. Emotional containment was. Even childbirth reinforced these beliefs. The physical processes of pregnancy and menstruation were interpreted as evidence that women were governed by fluids. This made them mysterious. Psychology became an excuse for social hierarchy. Medieval scholars never thought that women might be emotional because their lives were hard, dangerous, and tiring. That idea would have required thinking, and thinking was dangerous. Modern psychology sees emotion as human. Medieval psychology blamed water, and somehow this explanation lasted for centuries, showing that confidence, not accuracy, is often the most persuasive force of all. Once medieval psychology finished blaming emotions on fluids, temperature, and dampness, it turned its attention to dreams and immediately decided that the brain could not possibly be responsible. Dreams were not random. They were not memory fragments. They were not the result of stress, digestion, or that questionable cheese you ate before bed. Dreams were messages. The only question was messages from whom? According to medieval thinkers, dreams could come from God, angels, demons, the stars, your bodily humors, or your dinner, sometimes all at once. Interpretation was everything. A dream wasn't something you experienced, it was something you needed decoded before it ruined your life. Pleasant dreams were suspicious. Why was your mind so relaxed? What were you forgetting to repent for? Nightmares, on the other hand, were very useful. They could indicate sin, spiritual attack, demonic influence, or internal imbalance. Medieval psychology loved dreams because it was definitely your fault, no matter what happened. Medical texts say that dreams are vapors that rise from the stomach to the brain while you sleep. If those vapors were heavy, you had dark dreams. If they were light, you had pleasant ones. If they were chaotic, you were ill. This meant that digestion was not only important for health, but it was also shaping your subconscious. Dream interpretation manuals became very popular. These books listed symbols and their meanings with great confidence. For example, snakes meant betrayal. Fire. Dreams were rarely seen as neutral. Medieval psychology didn't believe in neutral mental experiences. Monks took dreams especially seriously. A single vivid dream could lead to days of prayer, fasting, and anxiety. Dreams were treated as evidence, evidence of temptation, evidence of divine testing, evidence that your mind was not under proper control. Even erotic dreams were considered moral. Falling meant moral weakness. Teeth falling out meant something bad. It was never good. Failures despite happening while unconscious. Medieval psychology managed to invent guilt that operated independently of your awareness. You could sin in your sleep and still be held accountable. Truly impressive. Modern psychology sees dreams as the brain processing information. Medieval psychology saw them as supernatural performance reviews. And like all performance reviews, they were stressful, confusing, and never quite explained what you were supposed to do better next time. After medieval psychology finished, at one of its most daring conclusions, it said that if your mind was struggling, you had done something wrong. Mental illness was not a condition or a health issue, it was a character flaw with spiritual consequences. If someone acted strangely, heard voices, withdrew from society, or felt intense fear, medieval psychology didn't ask what they were going through, it asked what sin had caused it. People thought that mental suffering was a punishment, possession, or weakness of faith. sometimes all three if the situation called for enthusiasm. This belief was very convenient. If mental suffering came from moral failure, then society didn't need to offer care, support, or understanding. It needed discipline, correction, prayer, and sometimes restraint. People with mental illness were often told to confess, repent, fast, or pray harder. If that didn't work, the assumption was not that the treatment was ineffective. It was that the person was resisting divine help. Responsibility always flowed downward. In more extreme cases, individuals were restrained, isolated, or handed over to religious authorities, not for cruelty, but for correction. Medieval psychology truly believed that isolation and punishment could bring the mind back into alignment. If someone screamed, it meant the soul was fighting. If someone went silent, it meant the soul was losing. Either outcome was interpreted as progress. There was also a hierarchy of acceptable suffering. Scholars' melancholy was tolerated, while peasants' madness was viewed with suspicion. A noble's eccentric behavior was seen as odd, while a poor person's similar actions were deemed dangerous. Psychology adapted seamlessly to social class distinctions. The most uncomfortable truth is that medieval psychology did not aim to be cruel. Rather, it sought to impose order. A world devoid of explanations is frightening, prompting medieval thinkers to devise rationales that upheld authority and moral clarity. Regrettably, these explanations morphed into modern psychology sees mental illness as complicated with biological, psychological, and social causes. Medieval psychology saw it as disobedience. When you call illness a sin, the cure stops being compassion and starts being control, which medieval society was very good at. Once medieval psychology decided that mental suffering was a moral issue, it moved on to fear and immediately concluded that fear was not an emotion, but a mechanical failure. Fear didn't come from danger, uncertainty, or the perfectly reasonable awareness that medieval life was horrifying. Fear came from weak blood flow. According to medieval thinkers, courage was the result of warm, fast-stem moving blood, circulating bravely through the body. Fear happened when blood cooled, slowed, or retreated inward like it had lost confidence. A frightened person wasn't cautious, they were poorly circulated. This explained everything medieval society already believed. Brave men were hot-blooded. Cowards were cold. Fear literally made the heart shrink, the limbs shake, and the face turn pale. All of these were signs that the vital spirits were leaving the battlefield. Medieval psychology saw fear and said, "Ah, yes, your blood has left you." To get rid of fear, you had to warm the body and get the blood flowing. This meant eating hot foods, drinking wine, using spices, working out, and sometimes yelling at the scared person until they got better. If you were scared, you weren't offered comfort. You were told to make your metabolism stronger. Soldiers who panicked in battle were not thought to be traumatized. They were broken. Their blood wasn't very strong. Their hearts were cold. Fear was not a way to stay alive. It was a personal failure that had effects on biology. People thought women were more scared because they were colder by nature. Kids were scared because their bodies were still growing. Older people were scared because their heat was going away. In every case, fear was framed as a physical decline instead of an emotional response. Medieval psychology never thought about the fact that fear can be smart. Fear keeps you alive. Fear lets you know when something is risky. Fear is a kind of information. But saying that would mean admitting that it might be reasonable to be scared in a city with a plague. And medieval psychology did not value reason. Fear's physicality was even linked to bad dreams. If you woke up shaking, it meant that your blood had cooled down too much while you were sleeping. Comfort wasn't the answer. It was warm. More blankets, more food, and less thinking. Always less thinking. Current psychology regards fear as a defensive reaction. Medieval psychology viewed it as a circulatory issue. And to be honest, maybe fear was the best instinct people had because there wasn't much safety gear. Even though medieval science tried for hundreds of years to get rid of it, medieval psychology blamed your feelings on fluids, temperature, morality, and blood flow. It finally reached what it thought was the last unarguable explanation. The planets did it. People in the Middle Ages thought that the position of the stars and planets at the time of your birth had a big effect on your personality, emotions, and mental health. Not figuratively, literally. Mars was more than just a symbol of anger. It put it in place. Saturn didn't make me feel sad. It brought it to them in person, signed, sealed, and promised. This meant that your mind wasn't completely yours. It was rented. Astrology was not a strange idea. It was a common idea in psychology. Everyone, from scholars to doctors to clergy, agreed that the heavens shaped human thought in the same way that the moon shaped the tides, but with more paperwork and fewer refunds. Mercury was acting up if you were worried. Mars was close by if you were angry. If you were sad, Saturn had parked in the wrong house. And if everything in your life was falling apart, congratulations, you were born at a bad time. People treated birth charts like psychological profiles. Before making a diagnosis, doctors talked to them. Diagnosis. Before making decisions, kings asked them for advice. Parents asked them to help them understand why one child was calm and the other was not. The nice thing about astrology was that it made sense of everything and let everyone off the hook. You didn't mean to lose your temper. It wasn't your fault that you were sad. You didn't make bad choices on purpose. It was written in the stars. Accountability was somewhere between Jupiter and nowhere. Astrology even affected how people were treated. Some days were thought to be better for bloodletting, purging, or fixing emotional problems. It was impressive that things could get worse if a medical procedure was done when the planets were not in the right position. People in the Middle Ages also thought that the influence of planets could change. If Venus moves, you could be emotionally stable one month and crazy the next. This made it unnecessary to think about oneself. Why work on yourself when the universe might fix it next week? New. Psychology examines patterns, biology, and the environment. Medieval psychology looked at the sky and said, yes, that explains your personality. Nowadays, astrology is mostly used for fun, but back then it was used for therapy, diagnosis, and as an excuse. At the very least, it was comforting. Your problems weren't just random, they were planned by the universe. After medieval psychology sent your personality to the planets, it decided to look inside the human head without actually opening it, of course, and saying that there was another breakthrough. The brain is like a small, wet building with rooms for thinking. Medieval scholars believed that the brain was made up of compartments or cells, each of which was in charge of a different mental task. Memory was in one room. Another one was home to imagination. Reason was in the front because it was clear that reason wanted a window. If one room broke down, that made sense of everything. People took this model very seriously. If you forgot, your memory chamber was weak, so you forgot things. If you saw things that weren't there, your imagination room was empty. Your reason chamber was poorly furnished if you made bad choices. Now, mental illness was a problem with home decor. Medical books went into great detail about these rooms, even though no one had ever seen them. The front of the brain was in charge of reasoning. The middle part was about using your imagination. And the back stored memories, which is why head injuries were so scary. A hit to the wrong place didn't just. It hurt and changed the way you think. And yes, medieval psychology thought that diet, emotions, and the weather could change these rooms physically. The brain got too wet because of the cold air. It dried out in the heat. Overthinking made some rooms too hot. Medieval thinkers thought of the brain as a medieval house with bad insulation and mold problems all the time. This idea affected how people were treated. Doctors suggested using herbs, prayers, repetition, and sometimes strong smells to make the memory chamber stronger. Because nothing makes you remember things better than being hit by incense. If patients' imaginations were running wild, they were told to cut back on stimulation, stay away from stories, and stop coming up with new ideas. Medieval psychology thought this was a perfectly reasonable request. This model also had an effect on education. It was dangerous to learn too much too quickly. You could put too much in a chamber. It's better to memorize things slowly, carefully, and with help. It wasn't impressive to have a mind full of knowledge. It was not safe to build. Modern neuroscience charts networks and steps. Medieval psychology made maps of floors. And even though the idea of mental rooms sounds silly now, it gave people in the Middle Ages a sense of control. If the mind had a structure, it would be easier to handle. It could be fixed if it could be handled. Even if the blueprint was completely made up, medieval psychology carefully explained where your memories were stored and which room your imagination was acting up in. Then it turned its suspicious gaze toward happiness and decided that it was too much. Joy was a health risk. Yes, it was okay to be happy. Being very happy is very worrying. Medieval philosophers posited that profound joy could lead to cardiac overheating, and a heart that was too hot was bad. Keep in mind that the heart was more than just a pump. It was the center of emotional control. If joy became too much, the heart grew, the spirits rushed, the balance broke, and death came without warning. This meant that medieval psychology really did tell people not to get too excited. It was dangerous to get sudden good news. Needed laughter, not too much. Celebration needed to be controlled. Doctors told people who were very happy to stay calm, rest, and cool down emotionally, because too much joy could kill you faster than too much sadness. There were a lot of scary examples in medieval texts that were meant to scare people into being more calm. Tales of people who died laughing, people who fell over from excitement, and people who got great news and died right away. If these stories were blown out of proportion, misunderstood, or made up, didn't matter. They were cited with confidence, and confidence was the best tool of medieval psychology. It was even dangerous to be happy because of love. Being too happy in love could make you weak. Passion stirred spirits too much. A happy heart was a careless heart. According to medieval wisdom, the safest emotional state was calm contentment with a little worry. This idea made it good to hold back your feelings. A person who was calm was healthy. A person who looked happy was doubtful. Someone who laughed loudly in public was either drunk, doing something wrong, or about to pass out. Living in a monastery strengthened this idea. Too much emotion, even happiness, got in the way of spiritual focus. Too many smiles could mean you're proud. Laughter could lead to temptation. Medieval psychology quietly said that calmness was the only safe way to feel. Modern psychology promotes happiness, connection, and the expression of emotions. Medieval psychology promoted emotional regulation. And in a world where disease, famine, or war could take away happiness at any time, maybe it made sense to not trust joy, because if you never let yourself be too happy, you never risked losing it. It wasn't being hopeful, it was managing emotional risk. Medieval psychology was very, very afraid of taking risks, especially when it came to smiling too much. Medieval psychology, after determining that excessive happiness could be fatal, redirected its focus to children and arrived at another assured conclusion. Kids weren't fully human yet. Not. Figuratively, literally incomplete, like furniture that wasn't put together right. Medieval thinkers thought that moisture controlled children almost completely. Their bodies were soft, wet, and not very stable. Their minds were even worse. Medieval psychology said that a child's brain wasn't strong enough to support good reasoning. This explained everything from kids throwing tantrums to being curious to the fact that they asked annoying questions. People didn't think of kids as growing mentally. They were thought to be unstructured. Their thoughts got away from them. Their feelings were too much to handle. They lost an interest. None of this was thought to be normal growth. It was seen as proof of a lack. Because of this, kids weren't encouraged to show their feelings or talk about them. It was fixed: loud laughter, too much alcohol, crying, weak control, fear, cold blood, curiosity, and dangerous thoughts. Childhood was not a time to be understood. It was something that needed to be managed. This belief was reflected in education. Learning was heavily focused on memorization and following orders. People were told not to use their imaginations because it made the wrong part of the brain stronger. Playing too much was a waste of time. Too many questions were suspicious. A good child was quiet, did what they were told, and didn't show their feelings. Basically, a little adult with worse coordination. Discipline was strict, not because parents in the Middle Ages were especially cruel, but because psychology backed it up. If kids were unstable, being firm gave them structure. Pain was a teacher. Fear was a way to fix things. It was up to you whether or not to show affection. Even love was handled with care. Too much warmth could make a child cranky. Too much comfort might keep the humors from settling down. Medieval psychology posited that resilience derived from restraint rather than support. And because people thought kids weren't done growing up, their feelings weren't taken seriously very often. A child who was in trouble wasn't worried or stressed out. They weren't lined up right. The answer was to fix things, not talk about them. Modern psychology views childhood as basic. Medieval psychology viewed survival as a challenge. Kids weren't pushed to grow up emotionally. People thought they would get stronger, and in a world that valued endurance above all else, medieval psychology thought it was doing the kids a favor, even though it never asked them how they felt about it. After medieval psychology decided that kids needed to be toughened up instead of cared for, it turned to adults and said it had found another way to help people with mental problems. Stop talking, according to. Medieval thinkers were not just polite, it was good for your health. Words made the mind move. Words came after thoughts. Emotions came after thoughts. And, as we've already said, emotions were dangerous, wet, hot, morally questionable, and probably full of bile. So, silence was good for you. Monastic psychology refined this concept. Monks thought that talking made the mind scatter, while silence brought it back together. Too much talking made reason weaker. It was dangerous to joke. Complaining was bad for your spirit. Silence made it possible. Thoughts to calm down, moods to calm down, and the soul to stop doing whatever it was doing wrong. Medieval psychology promoted restrained speech even beyond monasteries. People thought that quiet people were smart. People thought that someone who talked a lot was unstable. Someone who spoke with passion or emotion was not expressive. They were not balanced. Too many words meant too many thoughts, and too many thoughts led straight back to insanity. People who were in distress were especially told to be quiet. Are you feeling anxious? Stay quiet. Are you sad? Don't say anything. Are you angry? Be quiet for sure. People in the Middle Ages thought that talking about feelings made them stronger. Suppressing thoughts wasn't the same as repressing them, just like blowing on a fire. It was upkeep. This idea also made silence a good thing. People who were quiet were disciplined. People who were loud were suspicious. People who spoke out, especially against authority, were not seen as dissenters. It was framed as mental instability. If you were too angry, maybe your humors were acting up. Women were. More than men were told to be quiet. People thought that emotional speech showed instability and that silence was a way to protect themselves. People were silenced by medieval psychology on purpose. It made silence a medical issue, and to be fair, sometimes silence helped. In a world that is loud and chaotic, Quiet times probably helped the mind relax, but medieval psychology didn't stop there. It didn't say to find balance, it said to suppress. Modern psychology promotes expression, contemplation, and communication. Medieval psychology promoted silent compliance. Being quiet didn't help you understand yourself. It was about keeping yourself in check. And in a society that cared a lot about order, silence was the best way to keep their minds healthy, even if it didn't fix anything and taught people to keep their pain to themselves. Medieval psychology elucidated emotions through fluids, fear via circulation, joy through cardiac explosions, and silence as a therapeutic modality, culminating in its comprehensive, unifying theory. The mind did not exist independently. There wasn't anything like mental health. There was only alignment of the spirit. Everything, including thoughts, feelings, and actions, was connected to the soul. If your mind was having trouble, it meant your soul was not in order. If you let your feelings get the best of you, your soul wasn't disciplined. Medieval psychology didn't care what happened to you if you were sad, bad, confused, or scared. It asked what you didn't do. This made it very easy to talk about and very hard to get away from psychological pain. If the mind was just a reflection of spiritual, if health was the issue, then understanding, support, or care were not the answers. The answer was to obey, pray, repent, and fix your morals. Mental distress was dealt with in the same way as moral failure, by giving instructions and taking charge. This belief put all of the psychological ideas we've talked about into one solid system. Sadness was not an emotion. It was a lack of balance in the spirit. Anger wasn't the same as being frustrated. It was a moral fire. Fear wasn't something that came naturally. It was a lack of faith. Joy wasn't the same as relief. It was risk to the spirit. And since the soul was eternal, pain was often seen as having a purpose. Strength built character, struggle shaped character. It wasn't possible to get rid of mental pain. It was something to get through and learn from. This way of looking at the world gave suffering a strange sense of meaning. If pain had a purpose, it wasn't random. It had a meaning, but it also meant that it was risky to ask for help. Looking for relief could be seen as avoiding spiritual growth. Authority gained a lot from this idea. If distress was spiritual, then priests, not patients, had the answers. Obedience turned into therapy, submission turned into healing, and asking questions about the system wasn't curiosity, it was a revolt. Contemporary psychology delineates the mind, body, and beliefs, acknowledging their interrelation. Medieval psychology combined them into one moral equation. And while that system helped keep order in medieval society, it did so by completely misunderstanding the mind. The medieval world was not lacking in smartness. It didn't have any tools. It used faith, tradition, fear, and trust to make sense of things, and it believed them completely, which might be the most human thing about it. This is the one psychological principle that medieval thinkers really understood, even if they didn't mean to. Every time, confidence is better than being right. Medieval popular psychology was effective not due to its accuracy, but because it was presented with unwavering conviction. There were no may, and we're still learning about this. Results may not be the same. Every explanation came fully formed, sure of itself, and not open to being questioned. Sad, black bile, angry, hot liver, confused, planetary interference, dreamed something strange, spiritual issue, mental struggle, moral failure, no doubt, no confusion, just answers. People really liked that. In a world full of war, disease, famine, and death, certainty was a comfort. It was scary not knowing why something happened. So, medieval psychology didn't go away. Room for doubt. It filled every gap with an explanation, even if the explanation was nonsense. In fact, it was better if the explanation was nonsense because nonsense is hard to disprove. These ideas spread because they were easy to understand, could be repeated, and were based on authority. Anyone could learn them, anyone could use them. You didn't need to do any training, research, or proof. You needed to be sure of yourself and keep a straight face. And once an idea was accepted, it kept getting stronger. The theory was proven if the treatment worked. If it didn't work, the patient was at. Wrong. The system got credit if someone got better. If someone didn't, the system told them why they should have it. That's not bad science, that's great propaganda. Hierarchy also helped medieval psychology. Knowledge moved down. People who study spoke. Everyone else paid attention. Asking questions wasn't being curious. It was not stable. Doubt itself turned into a sign. And here's where it gets awkward. This isn't just from the Middle Ages. People today like to think that we're immune to confidence. Not true. No, we are not. We still like simple answers, clear labels, and theories that tell us who's to blame. We still like things that are clear over things that are complicated. We still mix up truth and confidence. The medieval world didn't fail because it was dumb. It didn't work because it was human. People came up with explanations that made sense to them and fought hard to protect them because they didn't have many tools, data, or fear. Psychology wasn't about figuring out how minds work. It was about keeping things in order, making suffering seem less random and more understandable. So, when we laugh at medieval psychology, we're not just making fun of the past. We're looking at a version of ourselves that has worse hygiene and stronger opinions. And that might be the most psychologically correct conclusion that medieval science never meant to come to. The Adriatic Sea wasn't a calm stretch of blue water connecting friendly ports in the 3rd century BC. There were warships, merchant convoys, and coastal ships fighting over it. Strongholds, where the person who could control the waves had power. On its eastern shore, there was a rough land of mountains, islands, and tribes that were very independent. Their power didn't come from big armies, but from the sea itself. Teotut of Iria rose to power in this world of the sea. Teotut did not get a quiet throne. After King Agran died suddenly, she became regent and ruled for his young son, Pine. To people outside, especially the Greek city-states and the growing Roman Republic, this deal seemed weak. It didn't seem like a woman in charge of a warrior society known for raiding and sailing would last long. But those assumptions showed more about how people in other countries think than how things really are in Iria. Irian society was used to having strong leaders who showed their worth through action, not just their family ties. Chota knew this right away. Instead of softening Agron's policies or backing down to diplomacy, she embraced the basic elements of Irian power, such as ships, sailors, and the Adriatic coast's dominance. During her rule, Iria never stopped or thought about it. It grew, the Irian navy became more organized and more aggressive. Fast light ships patrolled the coast and the islands, hitting enemy ports and merchant ships with deadly accuracy. The Irians didn't think these actions were illegal piracy. They thought they were just a normal part of maritime warfare. Having control of the sea meant staying alive, getting rich, and having power. Tudor strongly defended this view of the world, saying that there was no difference between raiding and ruling. Tuda ruled from her coastal strongholds not as a ceremonial figure, but as a naval commander. She gave trusted captains power, strengthened ports, and encouraged seaborne raids that filled the coffers of the Irian Empire and kept rival powers on edge. Her rule was a sign of strength, not weakness. It wasn't just the raids that scared her neighbors, it was the confidence behind them. Tutter acted like a king who expected people to do what he said, not ask for permission. She acted like the Adriatic was already hers, and in many. In some ways, it did. For a short but important time, Iria stopped responding to bigger powers. Under Tuda, they were fighting them directly, ship by ship, wave by wave. Tu's power was based on a principle that scared her neighbors and brought her people together. The sea followed Irian law, not complaints from other countries. For generations, Irians along the Adriatic coast made a living by raiding ships. People used ships to stay alive, and taking goods from passing merchants was seen as the same as taxing land, routes, or taking livestock from the enemy. Toda did not try to change this tradition when she became regent. She made it official. Instead of seeing raids as random acts of banditry, Tuda gave local commanders a lot of freedom at sea. Captains knew that if they succeeded, they would be rewarded, and if they failed, they would be punished. They also knew that loyalty to the crown was not up for negotiation. This system made the Navy culture very harsh, but also very effective. Irian ships got faster, bolder, and better at working together. Cities on the coast that those who fought back were harassed. People who helped were not hurt. Greek and Roman traders didn't care much about this difference. Their ships were still boarded, their crews were still threatened, and their cargo was still taken. There were a lot of complaints coming in through diplomatic channels, especially from Rome, which was just starting to look east across the Adriatic. Roman senators called these acts piracy, a word that is full of moral outrage and political justification. The Tudor completely rejected the label when Roman diplomats came to ask for. They thought that negotiation would happen if they showed restraint. Instead, they met a ruler who spoke from a place of power. According to reports, the Tudor said that Irian custom did not stop private citizens from taking wealth at sea. The state was not responsible for what each sailor did. This sounded like being too proud to roam. For Iria, it was a declaration of independence. This was a very important clash of worldviews. Rome thought that the law came from a central authority. Toa was the king of a kingdom where power spread out, given to warriors who made a living by conquering. Both sides understood each other, they just wouldn't give in. Tudor was not starting a war by defending Irian maritime customs. She was keeping the economy of her kingdom strong. Limiting naval raids would make her captains, her treasury, and her legitimacy weaker. In Iria, power came from being strong, especially for a woman ruler in a violent political climate. Tudor saw order where Rome saw lawlessness, and as Roman patience wore thin, the Adriatic started to feel less like a shared sea and more like a fault line that would soon break into open war. For years, Rome had been annoyed, but not in a hurry about instability beyond the Adriatic. Iria was far away, broken up, and mostly useful for getting wood, slaves, and trade routes. But with Iria as a tutor, Irian activity at sea went from being a bother to being an embarrassment. Roman traders were attacked more and more boldly, and even worse, people were openly ignoring Rome's power. Roman diplomats were sent across the Adriatic to face the Irian court, which was the last straw. The goal of diplomacy was to show that Rome was still better than everyone else without killing anyone. Instead, it showed how little Tutor was afraid of Roman threats. She wouldn't stop Irian naval activities, and it is said that she let violence happen against one of the ambassadors on the way back. The message was clear, whether it was given directly or just accepted. Iria did not bend down. In Roman politics, you couldn't just ignore an insult like that. Rome was still figuring out who it was as a Mediterranean power, and reputation was just as important as land. Letting a foreign queen challenge Roman power at sea would show weakness, not just to Iria, but to all the coastal states that were watching closely. The Senate acted quickly. What started as a fight over piracy turned into a moral crusade. Rome said it wasn't conquering, but bringing order back. People thought that the First Roman-Irian War was necessary to stop the chaos. Rome didn't have much experience with big naval battles in the Adriatic for Teuta, but it wasn't surprising that they declared war. She had been in charge long enough to know that power leads to conflict. Yetria was not without defenses. It had fortified cities along its coast, sailors who were good at quick strikes and retreats, and knowledge of the local waters that was second to none. At least for now, the Adriatic was still Irian land. But Rome had something that Iria didn't: a lot of resources and a strong sense of organization. Roman ships crossed the sea with clear goals to take out coastal strongholds one by one. Cities that had once depended on Irian protection started to change their minds, putting survival ahead of loyalty. The war was a turning point. For the first time, Tutor faced an enemy who wouldn't be scared off by his reputation alone. The Adriatic was no longer just a place where ships fought and raided. It had become the front line of a fight between two ideas of power, and only one of them would eventually rule the sea. When Roman ships started showing up along the Adriatic coast, the war stopped being an abstract threat and became a daily reality. Ports that used to thrive on Irian protection now had to make a terrible choice: fight against Rome and risk death, or switch sides and live. This was the most dangerous time for Tudor of Area because she couldn't count on loyalty on land just because she had a strong navy. Rome moved forward in a planned way. Instead of, Roman generals went after Irian raiders at sea, but they also attacked cities on the coast, cutting off the infrastructure that Toda's fleet relied on. One by one, strongholds fell or gave up. Some cities were taken by force. Some people opened their gates without a fight, hoping that Roman protection would be more stable than Irian rule. Irian rulers had always used speed, fear, and geography to get what they wanted, and Tudor did the same. Her ships kept attacking Roman supply lines, bothering fleets, and messing up communications. Irian sailors who knew every inlet and current liked narrow channels, rocky shores, and hidden harbors. Roman ships had a hard time in these strange waters because they were heavier and less agile, but this benefit couldn't make up for Rome's stubbornness. In Irian warfare, quick blows were more important than endurance. In Roman warfare, endurance was more important. Quickly replacing losses and fixing fleets, there were more troops coming back. Every Roman victory, no matter how small, weakened Tudor's power. The mental effects were just as bad. Irian commanders, who had once acted on their own, now had to deal with an enemy that punished those who hesitated and rewarded those who betrayed them. Some local leaders left Tuda and made their own deals with Rome. Every defection made the illusion of unity that had kept Arian power strong weaker. As the pressure grew, Tutor pulled back from the most vulnerable coastal positions and moved inland, relying on fortified centers that were farther away from the Romans. This strategic retreat kept her safe, but it also meant she had lost. Of the sea, the Adriatic, which Arian ships used to rule, was slowly getting away from her. The war showed a harsh truth. Tudor had learned how to use Irian power, but Rome was fighting a different kind of war, one based on discipline, logistics, and staying in one place for a long time. The fight was no longer about piracy or pride, it was about staying alive. And Iria was being pushed into a defensive position that it had never really known before. The war reached its most important point as Roman pressure grew. Iria could still hurt Rome, but it couldn't stop it any longer. The steady decline of coastal cities blocked Tudor's access to the sea, which was the source of her power. Without ports, fleets were a problem. Ships needed places to dock, food, and safe passage. Rome knew this and kept pushing its advantage. When her maritime network fell apart, Tudor made a strategic choice based on survival instead of pride. She went to Rome to talk about peace, not as a defeated pirate queen, but as a ruler who wanted to keep what was left of her kingdom. The settlement that came out of it was harsh. Iria had to pay tribute, give up control of most of its coastline and cut back on its naval operations. Without permission from the Romans, Irian ships could not sail south of a certain line. Roman law now controlled the Adriatic, which had once been her territory. Tuda's removal from power was the most shocking thing of all. Whether she officially stepped down or was pushed out of politics, the war ended her reign. Rome put client rulers in charge, who were more willing to follow its orders, making sure that Iria would never again threaten Roman shipping with the same level of confidence. But losing didn't erase Toda's legacy. Rome had won the war, but it had not stopped the message of her rule. For the first time, Rome fought a war that wasn't just about conquest. It was also about fighting against a female ruler who wouldn't back down. Later, Roman historians painted her as reckless and arrogant, saying that the war was a necessary lesson in order. But there was an truth that makes you feel bad. Tuda had made Rome pay attention to Iria. She changed the balance of power even when she lost. The war was Rome's first big military action east of the Adriatic, and it cleared the way for future expansion into Greece and the Balkans. Iria was a place where Roman imperial policy was tested, and it was there that Rome learned how to control maritime areas instead of destroying them. After her fall, Tudor was no longer mentioned in history, but her shadow lived on. She had been in charge and at the edge of empire and would not back down quietly. She left a warning in Roman memory, even though she lost her fleet and crown. The sea was never really tamed, and anyone who stood up to it could make Rome do something. After winning, Rome did what it always did. It took power away from Toyota. It took over not just land, but also the story. Roman historians, senators, and later chroniclers characterized the initial Roman-Irian conflict as a civilizing endeavor. People said that Iria had no laws and that its sailors were pirates. Its queen was an unstable ruler who needed to be put in her place. For hundreds of years, this version of events would be the most common one in surviving sources. Roman stories about Tuda of Iria make her seem more like a warning than a ruler. People say she is arrogant, impulsive, and not able to run things properly. People used her defense of Irian maritime customs as proof that she was morally wrong. By making her rule about her personal flaws, Rome didn't have to admit that Irian power was real or that her rule was effective. Leadership. These sources don't often say how seriously Rome took her. The Senate did not send fleets and legions to fight people it thought were unimportant. Rome crossed the Adriatic because Toda's policies hurt trade, questioned authority, and made it clear that Rome was weak at sea. In real life, she made Rome watch how it managed its maritime borders and build a stronger navy. The change in her image had a political purpose. By putting Toda in, Rome justified future interventions by saying that it was reckless. Now, any kind of resistance could be called piracy. Any defiance could be seen as chaos that needed Roman order. Iria became a model and a warning to other coastal powers that they would be punished and remembered badly for trying to be independent. But the fact that Roman writing was so hostile to Tudor shows how important he was. If she had been weak, no one would have paid attention to her. Instead, she became a symbol of chaos because she had made people in Rome feel like they were losing control. Her gender made this worse. Response: a woman in charge of the navy upset Roman expectations, making it easier to turn her into a caricature than to deal with the consequences of her rule. Outside of Roman texts, there are very few Arian voices left. You have to read between the lines of hostile sources to get the rest. There, a different number comes out. A regent who kept her kingdom's economy safe, upheld tradition, and made tough decisions in a harsh political climate. Rome may have written the history that we still have, but it didn't erase Tudor's. Effect: even in distortion, her presence lives on in Roman memory as a ruler who was strong enough to demand answers, condemnation, and justification long after her fall. Without her throne, and with her enemies writing about her, Tutor might have faded into obscurity. Her story lived on because it went against what people thought would happen. In a Mediterranean world ruled by male kings and generals, Tutor of Iria was different because he ruled from the sea, not from family ties or political power. Naval: in the past, it was hard to get and keep power. It took skilled sailors, a steady supply of resources, and a deep understanding of coastal geography. Tudor was in charge of all three. Her leadership was not just a symbol. She ran fleets, led campaigns, and made sure that maritime policy was followed along a broken coastline. Few rulers of her time, whether they were men or women, had such direct control over naval warfare. What made Tudor special wasn't just that she was in charge, but how she was in charge. She didn't try to adopt Urian traditions or foreign customs to make outsiders happy. Instead, she embraced the local values of independence, strength, and dominance over the sea. She got her power from doing things, not talking about them. Because she protected their way of life and rewarded success, captains followed her. But because she was a woman, her rule would be judged differently. Ancient historians found it difficult to explain how a woman could have military power without calling it too much or a failure. When male rulers were called ambitious, Tudor was. Called careless, she was shown as emotional when men were strategic. These distortions tell us more about what Romans were worried about than what was really going on in Iria. But even in negative accounts, Tudor's skills can't be denied. Rome didn't have to deal with a group of unorganized raiders. Instead, it had to deal with a coordinated naval power that could stop trade across an entire sea. Rome's first step toward long-term naval dominance in the eastern Adriatic was the war against Aeria, and it was Tutor who made that step happen. Outside of the military, her reign challenges what we think we know about ancient leaders. People often thought of Arian society as unimportant, but it produced a ruler who could stand up to the biggest republic of the time. Tudor's authority indicates that power structures in the ancient Balkans were more adaptable and practical than subsequent accounts acknowledge. She ruled for a short time, but she did so firmly. She lost, but not by a small amount. Tutter didn't just fight against Rome, she changed the geopolitical map that Rome would later control. By doing this, she, not just as a footnote, but as one of the most powerful maritime rulers in the ancient world. Arian resistance didn't end when Tudor was removed from power, but it did change the way it worked forever. The Adriatic Sea was no longer a disputed border governed by local customs after the First Roman-Arian War. Rome began to control, watch, and increasingly dominate the sea. The treaties that were put in place after Tutter's defeat were meant to do more than just punish. They were also meant to keep anyone from doing it again. The next ruler couldn't rebuild what she had made. There weren't many Arian ships, and they couldn't move around much. Ports that used to be independent were now connected to Roman interests through client rulers and garrisons. Trade routes moved west, which was good for Roman merchants because they could now sail with more safety. Rome got what it wanted from the start: predictable control over maritime trade. But this control came with a price. Rome had learned that the Adriatic Sea was not naturally obedient. It needed constant attention, patrols, and action. There were many rebellions in the years that followed, showing that Arian seafaring culture could be suppressed but not completely destroyed. Tutter's War showed how unstable the area was, and it made Rome make a long-term commitment that it hadn't planned to make. The post-Tutter era was a time of division for Iria. Without a single naval authority, local leaders fought for power and survival. Some worked with Rome openly. Some people quietly fought back, waiting for chances that almost never came. The time when Arian ruled the seas was over. Now, under Roman rule, they had to be careful about living together. Tudor's loss ironically sped up Rome's rise to become a real Mediterranean power. The war made Rome improve its navy, its naval strategy, and its ability to project power beyond Italy. What started as a response to Arian raids turned into practice for later wars against Carthage, Greece, and the Hellenistic kingdoms. So, Tutter's effect lasted longer than she did. Rule. She didn't just lose a war, she made Rome grow, change, and promise to expand its empire across the sea. The Adriatic that came next was quieter, more orderly, and more Roman. This is how Tota changed the future, even when she wasn't there. The sea that Arian captains used to rule didn't listen to them anymore, but it still showed signs of the queen who had made Rome cross it in force for the first time. History is kinder to winners than to losers, but some people still exist exactly because they stood up to too much power. This is a rare group that Tudor belongs to. Even though she lost and was forced to leave, she is still one of the first known female leaders to lead naval warfare on a regional scale. Her story lives on not because Rome wanted it to, but because it couldn't be ignored. Tudor's legacy is not one of victory, but of resistance. She was in charge at a time when Iria was on the verge of becoming part of a bigger imperial system. She didn't give in quietly. Instead, she claimed sovereignty in the only language that mattered along the Adriatic: control of the sea. Modern interpretations have started to remove Roman bias, showing a ruler who acted rationally in her cultural and political setting. During a time of great change, she protected economic lifelines, upheld tradition, and ruled with authority. That her methods went against Roman ideals doesn't mean they didn't work. It explains why Rome didn't like the Balkans and the rest of the Adriatic world. Teuta is a different option, a path that history did not follow, a naval power based on local control instead of empire, a queen who ruled not just through diplomacy, but also through ships, sailors, and strategy. Her silence in the historical record after losing is telling. Rome got rid of her, but it couldn't get rid of the memory of what she stood for. Every Roman patrol that crossed the Adriatic after that was, in some way, an answer to her challenge. Tudor did not create an empire. She did something less common. She stood up to one. It was still weak at that time. And even though Rome won in the end, the fact that it had to fight, explain, and rewrite her story means that her legacy will not be forgotten by time or conquest. The United States was much bigger when it woke up in 1800 than when it went to bed. With the Louisiana Purchase, President Thomas Jefferson had gotten a huge area of land that stretched west to places that no American leader had ever seen in person. It looked like a win on paper. In reality, it was a risk. Maps were unclear, and borders not sure, and the land beyond the Mississippi was still shaped more by rumors than by facts. Jefferson now owned a continent that he didn't really understand. This wasn't just a problem with geography for Jefferson, it was also a problem with politics. European powers were still close by. Most of the land was owned by native nations, and there were no known trade routes. The United States needed knowledge if it wanted to stay alive as more than just a coastal republic. We had to follow the rivers. They had to cross the mountains. Alliances had to be formed before competitors could take advantage of the gap. Jefferson's answer was an expedition that was different from anything the young country had done before. It would be a mix of science, diplomacy, and the military. He put Meriwether Lewis, a trusted aide with a strange mix of skills, in charge. Lewis was more than just an officer. He learned astronomy to find his way, botany to keep track of new species, and medicine to keep men alive when they were far from help. Jefferson taught him one-on-one, making sure that the mission was in line with the ideas of the Enlightenment as much as possible, as a goal for the country. Lewis knew he couldn't do this by himself. He picked William Clark, a seasoned frontiersman and soldier who had led troops and traveled through the wilderness many times before. Clark was officially below Lewis in rank, but he was an equal partner who earned respect through his skills rather than his title. They were both parts of Jefferson's vision, reason and perseverance. The mission's goals seemed very easy. Find a way to get to the Pacific, map out rivers and land, set up an American presence among indigenous nations. But there was something more important going on behind these goals. If the expedition failed, the West would stay a mystery and be easy to attack. If it worked, the U.S. would not only get land, but also its fate. They brought more than just food and tools with them when Lewis and Clark left. They had to live up to the hopes of a whole country. Jefferson was betting that knowledge could give him power and that curiosity could beat the empire. Soon, the expedition would see if ideals could last. Mountains, rivers, and things we don't know. The expedition finally set out in the spring of 18,004. Meriwether Lewis and William Clark led a small group of men known as the Corps of Discovery up the Missouri River from the last edge of American settlement. It wasn't a dramatic charge into the wild. It was a slow, steady push against the current, mile after mile, until they were exhausted. With every stroke of the oar, they moved further away from what they knew and closer to what they didn't know. The Missouri was both a guide and an enemy. Its waters twisted in ways that were hard to predict, and they were full of snags, shifting sandbars, and strong currents that punished anyone who let their guard down. Instead of distance, progress was measured by effort. Men pulled boats inch by inch along muddy banks, straining on tow ropes. Insects swarmed and the sun burned. There was no road to follow, and it wasn't clear how much longer the river would go west. Even though it was hard, discipline stayed strong. Lewis and Clark enforced routine with almost military precision. People kept watches and journals, written down and samples taken. Lewis couldn't stop thinking about what Jefferson had told him to do. This was not just a trip. It was an experiment in watching. Even when the men were tired and wanted to give up, they pressed plants, described animals, and sketched landscapes. The expedition also crossed a human border. Native nations lived along the river and saw Europeans and Americans come and go with different goals. Some meetings were careful, but friendly. Others were on edge because of rumors of American expansion and past betrayals by foreign traders. Lewis and Clark gave out peace medals with Jefferson's picture on them. These medals were symbols of a distant authority that few people really understood. Underneath the cooperation was doubt. The Corps relied on the goodwill of the natives for food, information, and help. But every alliance came with some risk. Misunderstandings could lead to death. Every day, gesture by gesture, word by word, trust had to be earned. Sickness, wounds, and being alone hurt morale. But surprisingly, no man died in the first few months. It wasn't just luck. The expedition was able to keep going because Lewis had medical training and Clark was a good leader. Other groups might have failed. One truth became clear as the Missouri stretched out in front of us. The river wouldn't just take them west, it would take away false hopes. The farther they went, the less the trip seemed like a planned mission, and the more it seemed like a test of endurance, adaptability, and trust in each other. It became more and more clear that maps and tools alone would not be enough as the expedition went deeper into the continent. The Missouri River could only show them the way for so long. There were mountains that no American had crossed from the east, climates that few people understood, and native nations whose languages and ways of life were strange to them. At this very important time, the expedition got one of its most important members, Sacagawea. Sacagawea didn't choose to be an explorer. He came into the story through situation. She was a young Shoshone woman who had been taken from her people years before and married Toussaint Charbonneau, a French-Canadian trader. Lewis and Clark knew right away what Sakagawa meant when they saw Charbonneau's camp, a bridge. She spoke Shoshone and Hidatsa, knew the land, and most importantly, she had cultural authority that the Corps didn't have. Her presence changed how people thought about the expedition. A military unit could make people suspicious, a group on a trip. With a woman and her baby son, it meant something different. Families didn't go to war parties. This one detail probably kept the Corps from having to deal with a lot of hostile situations. Sakagawa made people hesitate, wonder, and have room to talk things over when weapons made things tense. Her contributions were more than just symbolic. When food ran out, she knew which plants were safe to eat. She could identify landmarks from her childhood, which gave her important geographic information. Sagawa calmly got the journals and other things off the boat when it almost capsized. Instruments, keeping the records that Jefferson had asked for. Such moments, quiet and easy to miss, often meant the difference between life and death. But people have often made Sakagawa's role seem more romantic or simple than it really was. In legend, she was not a quiet guide pointing west. She was a young woman dealing with pregnancy, being a mother, and trauma while traveling through areas affected by loss and displacement. She wasn't strong because she was a hero. She was strong because she could keep going. She was always changing, balancing her own weakness with the needs of the expedition. Sakagawa was a real person for Lewis and Clark as they crossed the land. There were people in the West. Others lived in, remembered, and claimed it long before Americans got there. Every day, the expedition had to face this truth because she was there. Sakagawa became more than a guide as the Corps got closer to the mountains. She was a living reminder that to survive in the unknown, you needed to understand, hold back, and respect those who were there, knew the land already. The expedition learned a hard truth by the time the Missouri River started to get narrower and push against rising ground. Just water wouldn't get them to the Pacific. The Rocky Mountains were in front of them, and they were a much bigger barrier than Meriwether Lewis and William Clark had thought. The land had slowly risen from the east. It would fall hent from the west. There was snow, height, and doubt between them. Horses, not boats, were needed to cross the mountains. This made the expedition rely on native diplomacy in a very delicate way. The mission would end where the river did if there were no animals. Once again, Sakagawa was very important here. As they got closer to Shoshone land, she saw familiar places, and, in a moment full of emotion, she was reunited with her own people. Lewis and Clark got the horses they really needed through her. The Rockies were tough even with horses. The trails were narrow, supplies were running low, and winter came early. It snowed, so deep that it could swallow both people and animals. There wasn't much food. The Corps had to eat roots, candles, and any game they could catch in frozen ground. As the reality of starvation got closer, morale dropped. Leadership was more important than ever. Lewis had a hard time with all the responsibility, but Clark's steady presence kept the men going. It was no longer just a theory. A wrong turn could mean death. If you had to wait to cross, you would have to stay still. The mountains didn't care about Jefferson's goals or the fate of the country. Here, navigation depended more on trust than on tools. Native guides took them over passes that outsiders couldn't see. The Corps would have been lost without this information. The trip was no longer mapping out land for future settlers. It learned how to stay alive from people who had lived there for a long time. When they finally crossed the Continental Divide, there was no moment of victory or clear sign that they had made it. They were just tired and thin, air, and the grim realization that they were only halfway through their trip west. The Rockies hadn't beaten them, but they had stripped the expedition down to its core. There were rivers flowing toward the Pacific on the other side of the mountains, but they had to deal with hunger, humility, and the fact that the American West would never be easy to conquer. Once the expedition got past the Rockies, gravity finally worked in their favor. Rivers now flowed west, taking the Corps away from the mountains that almost killed them. Horses were replaced by canoes, and for the first time in months, moving around felt natural instead of forced. But the relief was short-lived because of how tired they were. Hunger had made the men weak. The boots were torn up. The spirits were weak. The rivers themselves didn't show any mercy. The clear water, Snake and Columbia, cut through steep canyons and made so much noise that boats could break. Navigation required constant attention. One wrong current could break up supplies or drown men who couldn't be saved. A few times, canoes flipped over, soaking important gear and almost ending the mission. Meeting native nations along the Columbia showed a world that was very different from the plains. Villages were bigger, trade networks were more complicated, and societies were very connected to the salmon runs that kept them alive. The Corps relied a lot on what people in the area knew, like how to keep fish and find their way around new waters. These interactions were businesslike, but careful. Word of Americans had gotten out ahead of them, changing what people thought and felt. The river brought disease. Men who were already at their limit got sick, which made them weaker. But leadership stayed strong. People talked about decisions in public. Discipline stayed strong, and morale stayed high even though everyone was going through a hard time. The expedition was lucky that almost all of its members were still alive. This was a huge success in a time when exploration often meant death for many people. When they finally smelled the salt, it didn't bring them joy, but disbelief. After months of rivers and mountains, the Pacific Ocean appeared gray and never-ending. The long-desired destination was real. There really was a western edge to the continent. The expedition had to stop because of winter. They built Fort Clatsop near the coast. Even though it rained, they got sick, and they were alone. The food was boring. Clothes rotted when they were always wet. But this break gave me time to think. Journals were finished, maps were improved, and specimens were put in order. The mission's goal changed from staying alive to writing things down. Standing by the ocean didn't feel like win. It felt like finishing something after a lot of pain. The Corps had crossed a whole continent without losing its core. The trip west had shown that the land was big, had people living on it, and was hard to get through, but it was possible to do so with teamwork and determination. The Pacific was the last place to explore in one direction. Ahead was the long trip back east, which would bring back knowledge that would change how the country saw itself and the land it claimed to own. Getting to the Pacific didn't mean the trip was over. In a lot of ways, the most. The most dangerous part was still to come. Winter had trapped the Corps on the coast, and when spring finally came, Meriwether Lewis and William Clark had to face a harsh truth. They had to cross everything again, this time against the clock, the weather, and their tiredness. New choices had to be made for the trip back. You couldn't just turn around on routes you knew. The snow stayed in the mountains for much longer than expected, causing delays and tough decisions. There weren't many supplies. The men were thinner, weaker, and tired from 2 years of constant stress. What I learned on the way west helped, but I still wasn't sure. Leadership changed over time. Lewis and Clark cut the Corps into pieces at certain points to explore more land and bring back as much as they could to Jefferson. This choice made things more dangerous, but it showed that they had faith because they had survived. The expedition was no longer making things up as they went along. It was working with experience that had been hard to get. There were small signs of tension. Lewis, weighed down by duty and likely to. Introspection, had a hard time making choices when under pressure. Clark's steadiness was once again important, keeping caution and momentum in check. Their partnership, which was built on hard work, stayed strong when other partnerships might have broken up. Memory shaped the encounters with native nations on the way back. Some people were happy to see the Corps back because they were familiar with them. Others were still cautious because they knew that Americans rarely went through land without coming back in larger numbers. The expedition brought gifts, words of peace, and promises it couldn't keep that were made. One event almost brought everything to an end. A hunting accident killed Lewis, which showed how fragile life was even after success. He got better slowly, pushing through the pain and weakness. The mission had to go on. History wouldn't wait for things to get better. As the rivers got wider and familiar landmarks came back into view, the feeling of distance faded. What had once seemed endless now seemed limited. The unknown had been discovered, mapped, and written down. When the Corps finally got back to the east, they didn't see themselves as heroes or conquerors. They came to testify. They carried journals full of notes, maps drawn from memory, and stories of working together, suffering, and being strong. The trip home finished what the expedition set out to do. People no longer thought about the West. It had been walked on, crossed, and lived. When the Corps of Discovery came back to the East, they brought back more than just stories of how they survived. They had knowledge that changed the way the United States thought about its own future in a big way. The journals of Meriwether Lewis and William Clark turned vague guesses into real things. Now rivers had classes. There were passes in the mountains. The West was no longer just a thought. It was a space. Their records listed hundreds of plant and animal species that American scientists didn't know about before. Some were useful discoveries that led to food, medicine, or trade. Others were just proof that the continent was full of life. Jefferson's dream of enlightenment had come true. Observation and reason had made it through the wild. The maps were probably the most important thing that the expedition left behind. Clark's maps showed the inside of North America with an accuracy never seen before. For many years, these maps would help traders, soldiers, and settlers find their way. Routes that were once only guesses were now found with certainty. The Mississippi was no longer the end of what Americans knew. It was just the start. But the information had effects that went far beyond science. The expedition proved that it was possible to move west. Hard, risky, and expensive, but doable. This realization sped up migration, trade, and, in the end, conquest. Soon after Lewis and Clark wrote about what they saw, roads, forts, and towns would be built. Native nations comprehended this transition more acutely than the majority of Americans. For them, the expedition was not a neutral act of discovery, but a sign. Maps are claims, and knowledge is power. Lewis and Clark usually acted with respect, but their success in the future, enabled, would not always follow that example. Sakagawa's part in this legacy is very telling. She went back to being relatively unknown, and her contributions were long downplayed or romanticized. But without her knowledge, language, and presence, the trip would have been much less likely to succeed. She stood for working together, but she also showed how history gives recognition in an unfair way. The expedition confirmed Jefferson's conviction that a republic could grow through intellect rather than violence by itself. It gave the country a sense of confidence that was almost certain. People would cross, settle, and claim the West. Lewis and Clark didn't conquer the continent, but they did open it up. Once it was open, it could never be closed again. When Meriwether Lewis and William Clark came back as national heroes, the price of the expedition's success wasn't clear right away. In the short term, the trip was seen as a success in terms of bravery, science, and leadership, but they knew that. Delivered didn't stay neutral for very long. After the land was mapped, it was possible to get to it, and as soon as it was possible to get to, it became a fight. The expedition set off events that no one person could control. Traders used the same paths that Lewis and Clark had used. Soldiers, surveyors, and settlers came next. What had been written down as geography quickly became law. Borders formed along rivers. Trails turned into paths for migration. The West started to fill up with new people who didn't have much understanding of the people who already lived there. The expedition was a turning point for native nations. Lewis and Clark often used diplomacy and restraint when they talked to tribes, but they also had the power of a government that was growing quickly. The stress of mass settlement made it impossible for promises of peace and coexistence to last. People broke treaties, they took land, cultures were moved or wiped out. The leaders of the expedition even had trouble with the results. Later, Clark worked for the government, in charge of native affairs, a job that put him at the center of forced relocations that he may not have fully understood during the trip. Lewis, who was troubled by personal problems and felt a lot of responsibility, died just a few years after coming back. His end was marked by being alone, not by victory. Sacagawere's fate was the same as this imbalance. She was very important to the mission's survival, but she didn't get much in return. Later, her picture would become a symbol of national unity, often without all the details. And the pain she went through. The West was happy to have her there, but they didn't think about how much her people had to pay. The expedition showed that exploration is never just about finding new things. It has to do with what comes next. Power changes lives, and knowledge changes power. Lewis and Clark opened a door that could never be closed, even if some people wanted it to be. Their trip is both an accomplishment and a warning. It showed what could be done with teamwork, planning, and hard work, but it also showed how quickly curiosity can become a victory. The core of discovery didn't mean to change the continent forever, but by showing it, they made change unavoidable. The Lewis and Clark expedition is still important in American history more than 200 years after the main part of the discovery returned east. It lasts not because it was perfect, but because it caught a moment when hope, ambition, and doubt all came together. The trip from the Mississippi to the Pacific changed how people thought about their country, itself, and what will happen next. The expedition became a foundational myth for the United States. It was exploration motivated by curiosity instead of conquest, and knowledge instead of brute force. People remembered Meriwether Lewis and William Clark as examples of bravery, working together, and not giving up. Their journals turned the wild into stories, letting Americans who would never go west picture it clearly. The expedition's real legacy, on the other hand, is more complicated. It is the start of a long chain of events that defined the 1800s. The knowledge that Lewis and Clark wrote down is part of the history of westward expansion, settlement, and conflict. What started as mapping and diplomacy turned into migration, displacement, and empire. People still remember the expedition mostly because of the story of Sacagawea. She has become a symbol of survival and guidance, and people often honor her with statues and money. But her true legacy is not in symbols, but in the real world. She embodied the essential function of indigenous knowledge in American exploration, a truth that has been downplayed or ignored for a long time. The expedition also changed how Americans thought about nature. It showed a continent that was very big, had a lot of different ecosystems, and was hard to live on. Rivers didn't always go where they were supposed to. Crossing mountains was not easy. To stay alive, you had to work together, be flexible, and be humble. People often forgot these lessons right after they learned them. Lewis and Clark didn't make a lot of money from what they did. Fame did not protect Lewis from inner turmoil. Nor did it spare Clark from moral compromise as the country grew. Their lives after the journey show us that big changes in history don't usually bring peace to the people who live through them. In the end, the Lewis and Clark expedition was more than just a way to get across land. It was a key moment. It was the moment when the American mind turned firmly to the West. And once that turn was made, there was no turning back. Before clothes were a sign of beauty, power, or identity, they were used for one simple goal: keeping people alive. The first clothes weren't meant to impress or set people apart. They were makeshift ways to deal with heat, cold, wind, sun, and injury. People wrapped themselves in animal skins, bark fibers, grasses, and hides sewn together with bone needles and sinew long before weaving looms or dyes were invented. What you wore depended on where you lived and what the land let you take from it. Clothing was insulation in cold places. Thick hides, layered furs, and tightly. Clothes that were wrapped up kept heat in and wind out. In places that were hotter, clothes did the opposite. Loose coverings kept the skin cool and let air flow through, which kept it from getting too hot and damaged by the sun. How well fabric worked with the weather rather than against it often made the difference between life and death. At this point, clothes were very useful and mostly the same. There wasn't much difference between what men, women, and children wore, except for size and what they were doing at the time. A piece of clothing's. People didn't care about how it looked. They cared about how long it would last and how comfortable it was. Tears were patched, hides were reused, and clothes were changed all the time. There was no way to waste. As groups of people stopped moving around and started to settle down, their clothes changed slowly. The seasons were easy to predict, which made people more willing to try new things. People twisted plant fibers like flax and hemp into thread. Weaving became easier. These changes made it possible to make clothes that were lighter and more flexible than animal skins alone, and easier to fix and copy. Even then, clothes were still very important for staying alive. If a garment was poorly made, it meant exposure. Using the wrong material made people sick. Early people knew this right away. Clothes were part of the same system of knowledge as food storage, fire, and shelter. It was not as separate from everyday life. That was just life. Clothes didn't start to mean more than just function until survival was pretty much guaranteed. Decoration, variation, and symbolism developed gradually, layered on top of designs that are useful, worked already. Before fabric showed who you were, it showed how you changed. In this way, old clothes tell a story about intelligence instead of style. Every fold, wrap, and stitch shows that people have learned from their surroundings for thousands of years. People were already fabric engineers long before fashion existed. They shaped materials to fit the needs of the world around them. As the societies became more complicated, clothing began to show not only survival, but also work and the environment. This is most clear when, in ancient Egypt, people dressed a certain way for thousands of years because of the heat, sun, and the Nile's yearly cycle. In this case, the fabric was chosen for its ability to breathe, be light, and stay clean, not for its warmth. Egyptian clothing was mostly made of linen. Linen was made from flax that grew along the Nile's fertile banks. It was cool against the skin and perfect for a hot, dry climate. Because it was light in color, it reflected sunlight instead of absorbing it, which helped the body keep its temperature stable. Not like wool or animal, linen could be washed easily, which was an important trait in a culture that valued cleanliness and ritual purity. The early Egyptian clothes were very simple in shape. Men wore short linen kilts that were tied around the waist, and women wore long dresses that fit closely and were held up by straps. These clothes weren't made to fit like they are now. They were wrapped, folded, and tied up so that they could be used again and again. The outline of the human body was still visible, which drew attention to movement instead of hiding it. Status came into clothing not through quality, not shape. Finer linen took more work to make and showed wealth and status. The rich wore sheer, well woven cloth, while the workers wore rougher cloth that was better for physical work. Clothes did not hide the social order, it showed it off quietly. Religion also had an effect on the choices of fabric. Priests had to wear linen because animal products were thought to be impure in religious settings. This rule made linen more important and linked clothing directly to cosmology. What you wore showed not only your place in society and your connection to the divine. Jewelry, wigs, and other accessories made things more complicated without changing the main clothes. Egyptians added meaning to simple things. The clothes still worked, but decoration let people be different, celebrate, and express themselves. The most important thing is self control. Egyptian clothes didn't change much over the years because they worked. The climate, materials, and cultural values were so well matched that new ideas weren't needed. Fashion in the modern sense didn't exist. There is a sense of urgency here. In ancient Egypt, clothes were a silent agreement between the environment and civilization. Linen wasn't a fashion, it was a solution that had been improved over many generations, showing that sometimes evolution means knowing when to stay the same. As people moved north into the Mediterranean world, the climate and culture changed ancient clothing once more. In ancient Greece, fabric was used for more than just comfort, it was also used for philosophy. Greek clothing showed balance, proportion, and a perfect view of the shape of a person, values that were present in art, architecture, and everyday life. Wool was the main fabric in Greek clothes. Greece's rocky land was better for sheep herding than for farming, unlike Egypt's flax rich land. Wool kept you warm on cool mornings and evenings, but it was also breathable enough for the heat of the day. It could be dyed, layered, and changed to fit different seasons and social situations. Draping, not cutting and stitching, was what made Greek clothes unique. The chiton and himation were basically big rectangles of cloth that were folded, pinned, and tied around the body. This method let clothes move naturally, focusing on posture and movement instead of stiff structure. The fabric fit the body well. This simplicity had a deeper meaning. Greek philosophers thought that balance and moderation led to harmony. Clothing reflected this belief. There wasn't much extra in the shape. The way the fabric fell and the way the person moved made it beautiful. Skill was not in tailoring, but in the way they wore the cloth, There were still social differences, but they were small. The length, quality, and color of the wool showed how important someone was. People could tell who was who by the way they dressed, whether they were citizens, foreigners, slaves, or women. But the basic shapes stayed the same. Clothing brought people together and let them have a hierarchy at the same time. Gender also had an effect on drapery. Men's clothes let them move freely in sports and in public. Women's clothing focused on coverage and continuity, which showed social expectations instead of physical limits. The fabric was not biased in any way. The way it was put together gave it meaning. Greek fashion changed more over time than Egyptian fashion did. Changes in length, fastening, and layering showed how tastes and politics changed. But drapery never stopped being innovative. The rectangular cloth stayed in the middle, showing that change didn't have to be hard. Greek clothing marks a turning point. Fabric was no longer just a way to protect yourself or show off. It turned into a visual philosophy. The Greeks used wool and drape to show that they thought order, balance, and beauty could be found in even the simplest materials if they were used with purpose. When ancient Rome took over the Greek world, it took on their styles of dress but changed their meanings. Roman clothes were still made of draped fabric, but in Rome, clothes were less about how beautiful they were and more about status, citizenship, and power. What you wore in Roman society was a public statement of who you were, and, more importantly, who you weren't. Wool was still the most popular material because it was strong and easy to find. Linen was around, and silk came later, but wool was the most important part of Roman life. The Greeks had a more flexible approach to dress, but the Romans had stricter rules. Clothing was controlled by tradition and sometimes by law. Dress codes helped keep order in a society that was obsessed with rank. The toga was the most important symbol of being Roman. Set aside mostly for men, it was heavy and hard to carry, not useful. This was on purpose. The toga wasn't made for work. It meant free time, power, and being involved in public life. To wear it meant you were a part of the state. This privilege was not available to slaves, foreigners, or most women. Roman clothes were mostly made of tunics. Everyone wore them, but not all tunics were the same. Status was shown by the stripes, length, and quality of the fabric. Senators wore wide purple stripes. Knights wore ones that were smaller. Even the color had meaning. Purple dye was costly and limited, making fabric a controlled sign of power. Women's clothes showed both their social status and their morals. The stole that respectable married women wore showed their legal and social status. Prostitutes and enslaved women were not allowed to wear it, which helped to keep moral lines clear through fabric. In Rome, clothes were more than just descriptive, it was a rule. As the empire grew, Roman fashion took ideas from other cultures. Silk from China, cotton from the East, and unusual dyes made their way into elite wardrobes. But these luxuries made people anxious. Roman authors said that foreign fabrics made traditional values weaker. Clothes became a place where tradition and globalization fought each other. Roman clothing shows a change in purpose. Fabric no longer just changed to fit the weather or looked good. It made things more organized. It kept things in order. In Rome, clothing was a way to keep an eye on people and make sure that the hierarchy was always clear. Egyptian ideas of balance or Greek ideas of balance are different. Roman clothing spoke in rules, which made it simple. People were judged based on how they looked, and fabric was one of the empire's best ways to show power without saying a word. Wool and linen were important in the Mediterranean world, but a very different textile revolution was happening in China. Clothing changed here because silk was so valuable that it changed economics, diplomacy, and the social order. People didn't just wear silk, people grew it, protected it, and raised it to the level of a symbol of civilization. Silk. It took accuracy and patience to make things. Silkworms ate mulberry leaves, spun delicate cocoons, and were picked at just the right time to keep the thread. Because this process required special skills and work, silk was hard to find and expensive. It was linked to power and refinement from the start, not need. Chinese clothes put a lot of emphasis on layering and structure. People wore robes that wrapped around their bodies and were held in place by sashes. This gave the impression of order and continuity. Chinese clothes are different from Greek drapery, were more standardized, which showed how confused people were about the values of hierarchy, harmony, and ritual. Clothing was meant to keep society stable, not show off individuals. Rank was sewn right into the fabric. There were rules about colors, patterns, and embroidery. Some colors were only for the rich. Silk with symbols on it showed official status and imperial favor. Wearing the wrong fabric wasn't a fashion faux pas. It was against the law and wrong. The weather still mattered. Silk's ability to keep heat in while staying light made it useful in a wide range of settings. People who weren't rich used linen and hemp, especially for work, but silk was the goal. It was smooth, shiny, and clearly different from rough materials. Silk showed status even from a distance. Silk had an effect on places far away from China. As demand grew, trade routes were made to move the fabric westward. Later, these routes would all be called the Silk Road. Silk brought not only money, but also ideas, styles, and cultural things. Trade. Long before the idea of globalization existed, clothing became a way to connect people around the world. But silk also helped to keep boundaries strong. People who made it kept a close eye on who knew how to make it. It was against the law to tell outsiders about the process. Here, fabric was power and power was safe. Clothing took on a whole new meaning in ancient China. It was no longer just a matter of adapting or ranking, it was an idea that could be seen. Silk turned cloth into a way to communicate order, power, and civilization, carefully woven to make sure that everyone knew exactly what their position was. As ancient civilizations spread across deserts, forests, mountains, and areas with monsoons, clothing changed less as a global trend and more as a set of local fixes. Climate had a direct effect on fabric, cut, and layering, showing that the environment had as much of an effect on fashion as culture did. People in the ancient world had to deal with the weather, resources, and their beliefs when choosing what to wear. In dry places like Mesopotamia and parts of the Near East, clothing put protection from the sun and sand first. Long, loose clothes covered the body and let air flow through. Linen and light wool were the most common materials. They were often layered to keep heat from getting trapped. It wasn't just modesty that made people cover their skin. It was a practical way to stay alive in a harsh climate. People in colder places wore different kinds of clothes. Wool, fur, and leather were very important to early Northern European societies. Instead of being draped, clothes were stitched together and fit closer to the body to keep you warm. Cloaks, leggings, and tunics that could be worn in layers made modular systems that could be changed throughout the day. Here, things got more complicated because survival required it. In South Asia and Southeast Asia, monsoon areas preferred breathable cotton, which is a good fiber for wet and rainy weather. Lightweight, quick drying, and easy to move clothing were important here. Wrap clothes let air flow and gave you more freedom of movement, and minimal stitching made them more comfortable in wet weather. Long before personal taste came into play, climate dictated design. The formula: culture influenced the interpretation of these solutions. Some cultures stressed exposure and movement, while others stressed hiding and layering. However, these differences were rarely random. They showed values that had to do with work, religion, and social order. Clothes became a way for people to show how they thought about the body's connection to the natural world. Trade slowly made these lines less clear. The places where the materials came from were not as far away as the places where they were used. Wool was a luxury in warm places. Silk was worn as a sign of status in cold places. Even when people started using fabrics from other countries, local styles stayed the same. Fashion has always had to fight against the weather. A pattern starts to show up. Ancient clothing did not develop towards a singular ideal. It split. Each civilization made clothes that worked best for its own environment and then added meaning to those clothes. Function came first, not fashion. Old clothes tell a world story, but not in the same way. It shows how people all over the world came up with different ways to solve the same problem: how to live in their environment in a way that is comfortable, visible, and meaningful. When ancient societies became more stable, clothing had changed a lot from just being for survival and the weather. Fabric turned into a language. It told people where you belonged, what you believed, and how you fit into the world around you. Long before people started writing things down, clothes were a way to show who you were. People often showed their tribal ties through their clothes. Specific patterns, colors, or the shape of clothes showed that someone belonged to a group. In a world where strangers could be dangerous, these visual cues were important. Before anyone said anything, clothes could tell if someone was a friend or an outsider. In this way, fabric became a social shortcut that made things less uncertain in crowded markets, border areas, and religious gatherings. Religion made this symbolism stronger. Sacred clothing set the divine apart from the everyday. Priests, shamans, and other people who did rituals wore clothes that set them apart from everyday life. These clothes were often limited, ritually cleaned, or only worn during ceremonies. Fabric took on meaning through belief and repetition. Putting on certain clothes made you temporarily something more than human, like a bridge between worlds. Dress also had rules about gender. Throughout ancient civilizations, clothing reinforced norms regarding conduct, mobility, and social space. Some clothes were made to limit movement on purpose, either to show status or to be modest. Some people stressed freedom and strength, which can mean work or war. These choices were not made by chance. They affected how people moved through society and how others saw them. Age and stage of life were also important. People of different ages, including kids, adults, married people, and older people, often wore different clothes. Clothes marked changes, getting older, getting married, and grieving. As a person's identity changed, so did the fabric that marked important events in their life. A piece of clothing that was fine to wear at one point in life may not be fine to wear at another. Even colors had meaning. It was hard to make dyes. Produce, and they were not always easy to find. Some colors came to mean mourning, celebration, power, or purity. Wearing the wrong color in the wrong place could be a sign of disrespect or rebellion. In this way, clothes were like a book of rules that other people always read and understood. What stands out is how little of this symbolism depended on being complicated. Most old clothes were easy to make. Meaning didn't come from fancy design, it came from everyone understanding. Everyone knew what some fabrics were, what colors and shapes meant. At this point, clothes had become a way to remember things. Every piece of clothing had layers of social knowledge woven into it so deeply that putting on clothes was like saying who you were without saying anything. As trade networks grew, clothing went through a new stage of development. Fabric was no longer limited to certain places or ways of doing things. It went places. And when textiles traveled long distances, they brought change with them. New materials made old ways of doing things harder to follow. Fashion became a place where old and new ideas could meet and work together. Trade routes linked civilizations that had never met in person. Merchants and middlemen traded linen from Egypt, wool from the Mediterranean, silk from East Asia, and cotton from South Asia. These fabrics didn't take the place of local clothes right away. Instead, they were slowly absorbed, and only the rich could afford them. Foreign cloth was a sign of wealth, access, and connections around the world. Technology got better. With trade, the way people wove got better. Looms worked better. Dyeing methods got better, which made colors deeper and more consistent. Patterning and embroidery gave clothing more ways to look. Clothes stayed structurally simple, but their surfaces became more interesting. This time also brought on stress. People in traditional societies often didn't trust fabrics from other countries. New materials put old moral codes and hierarchies in danger. In some cultures, laws were made to limit who could wear cloth from other countries. Silk, purple dyes, and fine cotton became regulated goods that were controlled to keep social boundaries. But change was going to happen. Climate and practicality were still important, but now aspiration was too. People wanted what other people had. Clothes became a way to show that you were connected to a bigger world. Wearing fabric from another country meant being part of something bigger than your own community. Styles that mixed different elements began to appear. Imported materials were used to make clothes in the area. Foreign cuts were made to fit the weather in the area. Clothes became layered not only in fabric, but also in meaning. One piece of clothing could show a person's environment, trade, identity, and goals all at the same time. This change did not get rid of older customs. It made them more complicated instead. Old clothes became a conversation between the past and the present, between what worked and what people wanted. Fabric turned into history in motion. At this point, clothes were no longer just reactive. It expected things to change. It changed before it had to. In the past, the world had found out that the clothes people wore could change how they saw themselves in relation to the world around them. Trade turned clothing into a way to keep track of who you met. Each thread told a story of crossing distances, sharing skills, and mixing cultures. And once those threads were woven together, ancient fashion could never be alone again. By the end of ancient times, clothing had changed in amazing ways. What started as a way to deal with cold, heat, and exposure had become one of the most powerful tools for putting people together in groups. The fabric no longer just kept the body safe. It set rank, showed belief, strengthened identity, and showed belonging without saying a word. Across ancient civilizations, clothing evolved in a similar way. First, there was survival, then adaptation, and finally meaning. Each layer added to the one before it, never completely replacing it. Even the most ornate silk robe or ceremonial garment was based on ideas that had been around for thousands of years. Durability, insulation, and breathability, and fit. What brought together ancient clothing styles was not fashion, but intelligence. People learned how to read their surroundings and turn that information into fabric. Climate shaped the materials, geography shaped the technique, and culture shaped the way things were understood. Clothes became a reflection of society as a whole. This change also shows something very human. People didn't give up on practicality when they started using symbolism. They combined the two instead. The clothes that worked and communicated at the same time were the best. Time. People in ancient times knew that a single piece of cloth could bring comfort, identity, and order together. We still have the legacy of old clothes around us. Modern clothes still follow old rules, like using layered fabrics, materials that are good for the weather, colors that mean something, and fashion that shows off your status. The only thing that has changed is speed. Fashion changes quickly, but the basic idea stays the same. We are not looking at something old or far away when we look at old clothes. We are seeing the base of how people learned how to get along with each other. Every tunic, kilt, robe, and wrap is a test of survival that eventually became a sign of civilization. In the end, old clothes tell a quiet but important story. Before writing, cities and empires, people wrapped themselves in the world around them. And through fabric, they learned not only how to stay alive, but also how to fit in.